Welcome. It's Donald Davidoff here again with another episode of The People Behind the Performance, where I interview folks in the industry, in the rental housing industry, that have really made their mark, and we try to get a little more of the personal story behind that. Those of you who might be seeing this for the first time, I am CEO and co-founder of Real Estate Business Analytics, and I'm here today with Dana Hamilton, who's a board member at Opendoor and formerly a senior managing director and head of real estate at Pretium, a $60 billion platform specialized or going into specialized alternative investment management, and was a true innovator in single family rentals. Prior to Pretium, Dana was a senior executive for more than 20 years at industry leader Archstone, including taking over their international operation in Europe. She's a seasoned executive and director with a history of creating value for stakeholders by building highly effective organizations and cultures and promoting performance-enhancing organizational and industry change. Dana graduated from Stanford University with a BA in Public Policy and Education and received her MBA from the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. More importantly, I'm honored to have worked many years with Dana and be able to call her my friend. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you.
So, Dana, as you think about the state of rental housing industry today, what's on your mind? Let's start with a really open-ended question.
I guess a couple things come to mind. The first thing is housing continues to be an incredibly strong asset class. I think that that's a function of continued, strong economy. It's on a relative basis, it's demand for housing, demand for more space, and frankly, less building for a variety of different reasons than we need to keep up with supply, with the demand for supply and obsolescence. Housing, I think, is also changing, maybe not as much as we expected it to change, while owning a home still remains a goal of many people. Renting a home in the 30 years that I've been in the business has become a very different experience. I think people have great choices. I think they have great partners, and rental housing has continued to grow and develop in many ways that I think we should be proud of.
Yeah, I'd say you've been through a lot, from the growth of a REIT to going private to being taken out. Then into the whole single family world where you did a lot there. I mean, maybe just talk a little more about that evolution, because it really is. I mean, I've been in the industry now a little more than 20 years. You've been in a bit longer than me. It really is amazingly different.
It is different. There are choices that people have today. I've been lucky enough to be part of what I would consider to be almost a revolution in three different parts of housing. The first was apartments in the US. So apartments in the US, when I got involved, which was in the early 1990s, had historically been what we would call a mom and pop business. And what we mean by that is nothing derogatory, but rather that there were smaller owners owning smaller numbers of apartments, and it was a very personal business. Mm-hmm. What happened when we often think about it as the REITs coming in, but what really happened when you had professional, larger operators and managers is that you were able to create brands, you were able to create experience, you were able to create transparency, reliability, choice, differentiation. And with that, came a price. On the other hand, there was also competition that created value for the residents making those choices. So we did that in apartments. There was an opportunity to do something similar in Europe. It's odd, there hadn't been much of a rental culture in parts of Europe like the UK, but places like Germany had a lot of rentals. People would rent for 15 years. So you could say, well, isn't that a rental culture? But those rentals were really more like homes. People put in their own kitchens. They made huge investments in bathrooms and closets and other things, but they happened to. And what we had the opportunity to do in the early 2000s was to really bring more of a US model of professional operations and management to that industry. And now we have a huge industry in Germany that looks a little bit more like the US. And then bouncing back to the US, we did something similar with single family rentals. Again, you might have had individuals who owned single family homes and rented them out, but there weren't large companies that did that in a coordinated fashion. Again, giving people that peace of mind, transparency, choice, and I think a higher level of value and service.
Yeah, I think I remember back coming out of the Great Recession, which is, because it was a balance sheet recession, home values dropped. That really created the opportunity, right? Kind of the Big Short. It created the opportunity for larger capital environments to buy up those homes. I still remember back around 2010 or 11, if you had asked me whether that was a business or a trade, I think I would have been on the trade side. You kind of ended up betting in your career that it was the business side. You were right. I was wrong. I'm glad for that because I got a chance to work with you some in that single family world as well. But maybe just talk a little bit. I always love your analysis on things like why was it successful or has it been successful as a business instead of just being a trade? Why, as housing prices recovered, were those institutional owners not suddenly motivated to just sell and have actually been able to make an operating business out of it? It's really, I don't know that it was obvious in 2010 or 11 that it was going to turn out the way it has.
It wasn't obvious, and I remember having a conversation with you before I made that leap, because I wanted to talk to people, who I respected how they thought about the business, to say, can this work? What actually convinced me was meeting a gentleman by the name of Don Mullen at Pretium, and he came from a very different world. He came from a very different asset class, not of sticks and bricks, as we would call them, not from real estate, but from financial assets. And what he helped me understand is that if you look at an asset, as a collection of attributes, and if you're able to understand it in that way, you can manage it. Now, that sounds easy in theory. In practice, what that meant was that there was a tremendous amount of data that was needed to understand every single home, to understand how they operate, what they needed, the consumer process, every part of the business. You needed information that was available now that wasn't available when we were at Archstone. So it's that information and looking at an asset not as something that we understand in a place being managed by particular people and competing with the apartment across the street, but rather it's a collection of attributes. And when you think that way, when you think that there's something common about all one-story homes that's different from two-story homes, and homes that are made of wood versus homes that are made of brick, and homes that were built 20 years ago and homes that were built 2 years ago, and homes built in Atlanta versus homes built in, Dallas, you can begin to manage that in an efficient way, because those distances between those homes, in essence, go away because you're able to look at aggregates. It's also true for the customer experience, and this ultimately happened with hotels, it happened with storage, it happened with apartments. In many cases, pushed forward by COVID, but I think it happened in single family homes first, which is that if you wanted to go see a house, right, instead of having to call a broker and organize your time, technology enabled you to put in some information, get a code, and go in yourself. And that was another thing that I couldn't have imagined either happening or wanting to do when I was in the apartment business. But that, by the time it came to single family, that option was present. And I think it was a big part of the difference. So the ability to deal with data in a cost-effective way, not just cost-effective, but time, and also the ability to use technology that would enhance the customer experience. I think those coming together is really what made it possible.
Yeah, I remember in 2019 talking to multifamily operators as a consultant, trying to get them to understand that a third to half of their customers didn't want somebody on the tour with them. And it was not just no, but hell no. And then it was amazing how quickly COVID changed everything. And now it's finding the right balance, sort of giving consumers choice. I also remember, I can't remember if it was Bryce Blair, may have been him. I saw somebody on a stage at a conference who was talking about the margins, because I was always, the reason I thought it was more of a trade than a business back then was just that couldn't see how to get the margins to be equal to multifamily. So once the balance sheet recovered, why not, classic Scott Sellers, why not take the money from that balance sheet and go invest it in multifamily, where your margins are going to be better. And I remember Bryce saying something to the effect of, well, you're right that we have some more expenses over here, but you're forgetting that we don't have expenses over there. We don't have to have a clubhouse. We don't have to have a pool. We don't, and all of a sudden when I heard him say that, I just went, oh, wait a moment. I've been a little too sort of cynical, and I'm not thinking about, well, what are the tailwinds that single family brings? So it is interesting how much they share and yet how very different they are.
There was an interesting, I would always say that the location was the amenity set, and that's similar to what you're quoting there, is that you didn't have to. Well, it also goes in terms of maintenance, as an example. You don't have elevators, you don't have anything that's complicated. You could literally buy every part and piece that you needed for a house at Home Depot, right? So that was a really interesting part of that isn't exactly obvious. Another thing that struck me is when we were renewing insurance for single family homes. Again, you'd think that there would be economies of scale, right? You have something together, shouldn't that always be better and less? But actually, you ended up having a different risk profile when you had individual homes rather than homes clustered together. So imagine a tornado, right? A tornado strikes everything that's right there. In the case of an apartment building, it would harm all of those apartments. In the case of a house, it would harm one house or maybe a few if they had them in a cluster. So I used to call it cluster risk. I think the industry calls it contagion risk, but it was fascinating to me that it was much less expensive to. I'm doing an interview. I'm sorry.
The joys of live interviews, no worries. We've had cats, dogs, husbands, wives. It's all good.
So we have a husband and he's looking for a dog who's not here. But it really surprised me that the cost of insurance was less as a function of disaggregating things rather than aggregating them. And when you think about it, it makes sense. One apartment, it can spread elsewhere. One apartment catches on fire, but a house, it's contained.
Yeah, that's funny you say that, because I still remember one of the early things we did on demand was recognizing that we didn't have to be quite as worried about dog breed restrictions, right? Like in the apartment world, somehow, and I don't want to get into the legal side of it, but somehow there's vicarious liability around, if a neighbor gets bitten by a dog, in the single family world, I mean, in the for sale world, I don't control or expect next door to not have whatever dog. And so all of a sudden, single family, like there's this group of people who apartments cannot sell to that single family could. Kind of another example, get into homes, et cetera. Cool. Well, let's switch gears and get back to a little bit of the personal side. Come back to data maybe in a little bit at the end. But you mentioned you started very young in the industry in the early 90s. I've always been fascinated by that story. Share with everyone, how did you start out in the rental housing industry? Because your degree was in education.
My degree was in education, and I was a teacher. I had the opportunity to go to business school, and I went to business school, and this was the early 1990s, and everyone was going into tech. And I had some classmates who were early on in eBay, and maybe I lacked imagination, but there was this whole area of real estate that everyone had moved away from. So as a general rule, if people are zigging, I think it's interesting to zag. And so there was a phenomenal real estate and finance community, and I joined that, and I was one of the very few. And when it came time to get a job, having been a teacher, it wasn't the easiest thing. Most people said, "What is it that you have to give?" And I ended up getting an offer from I think it was Cities Global Real Estate Group. And that was because the person interviewing me, his mother was a teacher, right? I think he understood how difficult it was to be a teacher. And then I interviewed with this group, Security Capital Group, and I had gone to see a gentleman by the name of Bill Sanders speak. And he was talking about REITs and why now and why real estate should be owned this way. And he asked if there were any questions, and I raised my hand. And I made what I guess was a somewhat intelligent question. And he said to me, he said, "What are you, a teacher?" And I said, "Actually, I am." And so that began a conversation. And I think that was ultimately what was the tipping point for my getting into that organization. But I would say that, and this speaks to how you and I met. One of the, if there's something that I did well or something that I really tried to keep that I think was helpful in terms of my career and whatever success I've had, it is being a teacher. It is about continuously learning. It's about asking questions. It's about staying humble in terms of the knowledge that exists. It's about trying to communicate things in a way that people can understand. It's ensuring that I'm not afraid to ask questions, that nothing gets in the way of doing that. And whenever I stray from that, I remember that it's actually, my having been a teacher and my having been a student that got me into this business. And I think that has helped propel me forward.
So what, one of my favorite questions, right? What's one thing about the industry that 2024 Dana Hamilton knows that 2024 Dana wishes she could go back and tell early 90s Dana? Because early 90s Dana didn't know it.
I think that falls into, there are a couple of categories that could go there. One of them definitely has to do with the importance of information, right? It's, relationships remain important, but information has such a different value today than it did before. And so, when I worked at Pretium, someone said you can never have enough information. You might have it too soon, but never enough. Mm-hmm. And that's something I wish I had known, because when you have a lot of time in the industry, there's a lot that I could have been doing to use later to better understand things. It was, I remember when we were first putting in place pricing and revenue management in apartments, one of the issues was the data density in that space, because the leases were so infrequent compared to things that you had done before. And so we had to create ways to work with that. So there were snippets of it that I recall today, but I did not fully understand the impact that technology would have, and would have loved to have, had that window into the future and leaned in even more than I did with the companies. I think the second thing is that, we are, each individual, we're a combination of our strengths and weaknesses. And I've always been a believer in leaning into your strengths more so than addressing your weaknesses. That being said, my older self says, hey, there's some of those weaknesses you could have worked on a lot earlier. I'm not a natural networker. I'm not a natural, I'm an introvert, right? I like to work. The computer and I incredibly well, and stepping outside of that, I think would have helped me grow and maybe help me grow others in the businesses that I've been involved with as well.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about pricing and revenue management on our way to talking about data, because Archstone was the pioneer. Obviously that's how I met you. That's how I got into this industry. I always refer to this industry as a flypaper industry, because we randomly buzz around and end up here and then you get stuck. Like I can't imagine 25 years later not being in the rental housing industry. It's been such a good ride. And I have to admit, it was complete happenstance, that I happened to end up involved. But Archstone saw something that others didn't see. I still somewhere buried in a cabinet have the COO from Equities quote at a NAREIT panel when asked what he thought about Archstone doing pricing, basically going, well, we're not hotels. They can go waste their money on that wherever they want. And of course, 4 or 5 years later, he wrote a multi-million-dollar check to Archstone to be able to participate in and use LRO. So sorry for the kind of the long soliloquy leading into that, but I mean, that was an amazing break. I mean, people today don't realize it's so de rigueur now. It was so out of the box in 1999. In 2001, when we started piloting it, I mean, it was 2003 before there was a second company using it, and I think 2006 before you needed both hands to count the number of companies using it. So I mean, that was a multi-year journey that Archstone bet on, believed in, nurtured. Talk a little bit about that, because I think people today could learn something from that.
I had an amazing mentor, and I think he's a mentor of yours too, which is Scott Sellers. And Scott he simply wasn't concerned with what other people thought, right? And he genuinely wasn't afraid of making mistakes. Now, that being said, we didn't make too many mistakes, because I think if you went after sound, rational things, chances are you were going to get better, even if it didn't work out exactly the way that you planned. So we had a number of those things that we really looked at other industries. So we read books together. We had speakers. We all were reading Fortune magazine and Forbes, and we were Harvard Business Review. We were reading them to understand how the best companies in other industries did things, and trying to find analogies. And so we tried not to think of our business as an apartment business, but rather, a multi-unit fixed asset business. And we'd say, okay, what's that like? What else is like this? And what do they do? So airlines, hotel rooms, rental cars, spaces on rides at Disney, and it just made sense. The same thing was true for online leasing. I remember discussions saying that, look, you can go to a car dealership, give them some basic information, and drive away. The people at our apartments, they can't drive away with the apartment. We know where to find them. How can we not make this easier? So it was really, again, I call it the teacher part of me, but Scott wasn't a teacher. He just did it naturally. It was looking around, trying to figure out what else is sufficiently similar, but also different. One of the things that I like to tell people is it's easy to find why two things are the same, but that's not particularly insightful. What's insightful is when you understand why they're different. So that's what, teasing out the differences of things that are grossly similar, I think, is really where you can find tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, I forgot about the story on, I remember you telling the car story was sort of the origins of SafeRent and automatic credit scoring. I still remember a conversation with, I was having lunch with Linda Bush, Dan Amidro, and Steve Tappert. And I had been put in charge of SafeRent. I mean, Archstone had already incubated it, was using it, but since it was analytical and demand oriented, I was put in charge of that. I was only a few months into my job with Archstone. And I remember saying to them at lunch, like, I hear about how to set cut points, and keep hearing people talk about, well, we want to decline X percent. And I went, why do you want to decline a certain percentage? Like, isn't it about risk management? Like, if they're all profitable, why would you want to decline anybody? On the other hand, you want to decline the ones that you're going to get a lot of bad debt. I remember Steve Tappert jumping out of his chair, practically hugging me. But it was the first time he'd heard somebody talk in risk management terms. That the whole reason they had done, the whole reason they taught the decline rate thing was it was the only way to get acceptance. Was to not, not shake the boat or rock the boat too much. So, God, that story just came back to me. I haven't told that story in 15, 20 years. Steve Cobb, I mean, Archstone was great at change management. Like, I take for granted
Mhm.
how much change management was embedded in our culture. And I forget not everybody's had that experience. That didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen quickly.
Mhm.
You know, what is your advice to executives who want to be more data driven, but at the end of the day, in rental housing, there's not a lot of existential risk, right? People are going to make money. It's just a matter of how much. So, what is your advice for both why they should take the plunge and take the risk, and more importantly, how to manage that risk, over a multi-year period?
There are, um, this sounds like a strange answer, but you know, we can continue to just do the same, right? And with that comes whatever comes with it, or you can figure out how to truly make a difference with what you do, which in housing means delighting the people who live there. It means making um, a living experience something that they, that people enjoy, that they want to stay for as long as they want to stay when it comes with a rental. And it's one of the things that brought me to real estate in the first place. It has a conscience, which is that house might be there or that apartment might be there longer than you're there. And so what are you going to do with it? How do you want it to be remembered? It's a part of a community. It's not transient. And so I think it is, on the one hand, the answer is, get help, like challenge yourself, right? Invite others to challenge what you do, ask why you do it. But I think it also is, think about, what kind of company, what kind of leader you want to be, what you aspire to do, and think about how you can do it better. It's one of the reasons that I was attracted to Open Doors, that it has always bothered me, at least in, let's say, the last 20 years, the way that people buy and sell homes. Every home that I've moved into in that period, probably longer, I found on my own. I thought about the pricing. I did this, and moving is stressful. It puts all of this anxiety on people. And it just needs to be better. And that's what they're going after. It was the same thing with rental homes and apartments. There just needed to be a way to make these industries better than they existed in their, in their former form.
No, it's great. It's a great answer. It's actually a very inspiring answer. Okay, now that we've kind of done the heavy lifting, last couple minutes, always like to end these interviews with a fun little rapid fire sort of James Lipton style Q&A. For those who remember, Mr. Lipton, excuse me, and Inside the Actors Studio. So there's only one rule I tell everybody: don't think too hard. Okay.
Mhm.
So just 7. I think he did 10 questions. We keep it to 7. What book has influenced you the most?
It's funny, I always remember Crossing to Safety. It's just a book I genuinely enjoyed how it was written. And
Excellent. What's your favorite time of day?
morning.
What is your favorite app?
The American Airlines app.
It's funny you say that, because if anybody ever asks me the question, my answer is FlightAware, which is a sad story for what's going on in our lives.
It's indeed. It truly makes my life better, and to me, that's the only reason for an app.
Yeah, United's app may have caught up by now, but I remember about 6 or 7 years ago, I was at a gate in Newark, and it was delayed. And FlightAware, I checked FlightAware, and it had showed a change in gate way across the airport. And I saw this guy with 4 stripes on his shirt. So I knew he was a captain, for the airline.
Mhm.
And I just had this sense that he was our pilot. And he
Mhm.
was on the phone, and I could tell he was frustrated. And so I asked, I said, "Excuse me, are you the captain for this flight coming up?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "You're waiting on ops, aren't you?" "Yeah." "Well, FlightAware just told me we changed gates." He hung up on ops and walked over with everybody to the new gate. So it may not be true today, but a few years ago, FlightAware had told me before the ops center at United told the captain that the gate had changed.
Airline apps. I mean, airline
Yeah.
apps, and they really get better. They tell me now that my baggage is on the plane. They tell
Yeah.
me all sorts of things I need to know.
Oh, I definitely, I'm a little too much into travel. Okay. Back to this. What is your pet peeve?
Being surprised.
What's your spirit animal?
I just got back from it, it's always been a sea otter, but I'm liking penguins. I just came back from Antarctica.
Penguins are cool. I'm an aeronautical engineer. There is nothing more aeronautical engineering built than a penguin swimming underwater. People
Oh,
don't realize air is a fluid, water is a fluid. Penguins are like the most aerodynamic things ever designed by nature.
unbelievable. I have a waddling penguin, and then you watch it go to the water, and then it
Oh yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Okay, two more questions. If you had to pick one food to eat forever, what would you eat?
roasted cauliflower.
First time I've heard that answer. Okay. And what is your go-to for having a good laugh?
My son.
Excellent. Thanks, Dana, for sharing all your insights with us. Where can everyone find out a little bit more about you and or any of the endeavors you're involved in right now?
You can Google me, you can go to LinkedIn, or you can reach out to me directly.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks again for joining us.